Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at TradeAthletics.com. This is a breakdown of Sixto Sanchez. Without further ado, let's get into the video. So first, some quick facts about Sixto before we break down his mechanics. There's definitely some interesting things going on, so definitely make sure to watch through the entire video. So he debuted August 22nd. He's actually only 22 years old. He's a rookie. He's listed at 6 foot, 235 pounds. So not a huge guy from a height standpoint, but pretty well built, pretty well filled out. He's averaging 99 miles an hour on his four seam, 97 on his sinker, and low 90s on his changeup. So pretty nasty stuff all around. Then as far as pitch usage, he actually mixes his pitches really well as well. So he's throwing 31% four seam, 20% sinkers, 26% changeups, and 23% sliders. So he really is mixing his pitches pretty well. But what I found interesting is that in his last start, his first postseason start, he actually threw 74% four seam. So he obviously had that pitch working for him that day. We'll get into that in a second. But being able to consistently touch 100 miles an hour obviously explains why he's able to go to that fastball when he needs it. He's been compared to Pedro Martinez. I think that's a fair comparison given his height, given his frame. He's obviously a bigger guy than Pedro was. He also throws a little bit harder than Pedro did. Pedro, and we'll put an overlay up here just so that you guys can see, but Pedro, I feel, had a little bit looser arm action, got into kind of deeper positions in his upper body. Also had a lower arm slot, which possibly gave him a little bit more deception, even though his fastball wasn't nearly as hard as Sixto's. But again, that's who he's consistently been compared to. I think that's a fair comparison. And so we'll get into his actual mechanics, break them down, and kind of explain what he does so well that helps him throw 100 miles an hour. All right, so the first factor I want to talk about is his tempo. Now, tempo is basically how quickly you move through your delivery, how quickly you move down the mound. Tempo is interesting because it's one of those things where there's an ideal range for each guy, and it's somewhat individual specific. But what we also see is that very, very hard throwers tend to fall in a specific range. And so I'm going to pull up this top video of Sixto just to kind of illustrate. So he would fall in what we call 22 frames would be his tempo if we're going to classify it. This is a classification that was originally defined by Paul Nyman in terms of him studying hard throwers, trying to establish, what are the commonalities between hard throwers that allow them to throw hard. And one of the things was tempo. And so what tempo is and what 22 frames means is you can kind of standardize every pitcher's delivery to a point that they all get to, right? They all get to a peak point of their leg lift, right? Some of them have slower leg lifts, some of them have balance points, but the peak point of the leg lift, right when that knee starts to descend, that's a common point that every pitcher gets to at some point. And so that's when he started counting the tempo, and he's counting these frames. So you can see every time I use the arrows to go through this, that's one frame. So we take him to his peak leg lift, right there. This is his peak leg lift. We start counting the frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So he's between 22 and 23 frames, again, depending on the pitch. This falls right in the range that we normally see for hard throwers, which is about 19 frames on the really quick end. That's someone like Jacob deGrom, all the way up to maybe 24, 25 frames, someone like Nolan Ryan, where it's a little bit slower. What you'll typically see is in lower level throwers, sometimes they'll be rushing down the mound and you'll get something like a 17 or 16 frame delivery where they don't really give their lower half a chance to build. And then what you'll also see is that a lot of lower level throwers will be too slow, too deliberate, and they'll really stall back over the rubber as they move down the mound. So Sixto does a good job. There's very little wasted movement. If we take a look at the side view of him, you can really see that center of mass is constantly moving. From that initial step back, his center of mass continues to move forward the entire time. So this is really why tempo is linked. It's not a direct cause of higher velocity, but it is correlated because an efficient delivery, you want that center of mass to continue moving forward with little wasted energy, little wasted effort. So if he just came to a balance point, he stayed over the rubber, he paused, he had all sorts of hitches, right? That ends up being an inefficiency where this center of mass doesn't get moving forward and you end up leaking energy more times than not. There are a few exceptions. There are some guys who are in that 26, 27, 28 frame tempo range who still do throw very hard, but they are very much in the minority. They tend to be the freak athletes, the 6'6" guys, super long arms. So again, tempo is kind of the first thing that I look to see, hey, do they fall in that normal range? And he's right in line with what you'll normally expect to see with 95 to 100 mile an hour throwers. So the next interesting thing that I noticed as I was researching for this video, as I was going through clips of Sixto throwing, is that 100% of the time that I saw on his fastball, he comes through his front leg, he blocks his front leg really well, and he actually breaks that front leg as he comes into ball release on all of his off-speed pitches. Now, I could be wrong, there could be exceptions to this, but every pitch that I looked at, this was the case. So I'm just going to play a couple fastballs, I'm going to let this loop. I want you to watch the action of the front leg into ball release. right? So we get into landing, and we look at what happens from landing, right? This front leg is blocked, and he comes up and over that front leg into release. So he's got something to effectively block against. This is the paw back mechanism we talked about, an effective lead leg block where that knee drives into extension and propels that torso, catapults that torso over the front leg, and allows that rotational energy from the pelvis to be blocked and rotate up the chain. So this is what we'd expect to see, right? This is an effective lead leg block. He comes up and over that lead leg. He does fall off after the fact, but that lead leg very much blocks that momentum and helps transmit the energy up through his arm. So what's interesting is you see his change up. I'm just going to pull that up right here. Right, this is not an isolated pitch. At first when I saw this, I thought it was an isolated pitch, but you actually see this on every single changeup that he throws. And so what I'm curious is if this was a teach that he learned somewhere along the way, or it's something that he just intuitively picked up, where he said, hey, I'm trying to keep the same arm speed, I'm trying to throw the crap out of it, but I want to take some velocity off this pitch while keeping my arm speed. And so he actively breaks that knee into ball release. And what's happening is he's basically eliminating that paw back mechanism, that lead leg block. He's not allowing it to effectively do its job, which I think is the point, because he's trying to take some speed off the pitch, which is hilarious because he's still throwing it 93 miles an hour with a foot of sink. So let's take a look at a side view of that, just so that you guys can more clearly see from a separate angle. So here's the changeup. Again, really obvious. Comes down the mound, front foot lands, right? He's in the same position here that he is on the fastball, but he's actively taking that knee and collapsing it out to the side. I think intentionally. It could be a subconscious thing as he just tries to take something off the pitch, but I think he was coached to do this. Let me know what you think in the comments, if this was a taught thing or if he's just subconsciously doing it. But again, this is just very interesting to see the massive difference between his changeup and his off-speed pitches and his fastball when he really gets through that front leg. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I want to take a look at is actually his arm slot on fastballs versus changeups. Now, I don't know if the Marlins would like me kind of discussing this and discussing kind of his tells and what's going on here, but let's take a look at the arm slot on his fastball, and let's pull up that arm slot on his changeup. So I don't know if you guys can see that difference. There's the arm slot. There's the arm slot. We'll do an overlay on the video, but at least I would say a 10 to 15 degree difference on the arm slot. So he's not only breaking that front knee on the changeup, but he's also dropping the arm slot on the changeup. So this is probably something he's going to eventually have to address as hitters start to pick up on this. But again, super nasty stuff either way. I just wanted to kind of point out the disparity between his fastball and his off speed in terms of the mechanics that we see. So the next thing I want to look at is his leg lift, and there's two main things that I want to identify in his leg lift and touch on. The first is that as he's going through his leg lift, yes, there's a slight shift of his center of mass, so he is keeping his center of mass moving forward. This is the weight shift or the drift that we talk about. What I want to really talk about is this coiling action that he gets. And so it's subtle, but if we look at his starting position, right, his belt buckle is roughly facing third base, and we look at how that changes during the course of his leg lift, right now his belt buckle is facing back this way. If we look at a front view, you can see this really drastically, right, belt buckle, third base, and he gets kind of this counter rotation, right? Now the knee is facing the shortstop, this belt buckle is facing out towards left center. So during that leg lift, what he's doing is he's taking the pelvis, he's coiling it over the back hip. Again, this is commonly taught, this is closing off the lower half, but what's really happening is that he's preloading the pelvis in a position to where he can hold that closed rotational hinge as he moves forward. So what this really does is it sets up the ensuing linear move. Right, it's a subtle thing, but it's an important thing. So he coils, he closes off the pelvis, he's still stacked, he's still quiet with the upper half during this move. And now he gets into the backside, he gets into that hinge that we talk about. And so this is the linear move right there. This entire motion right here, you can see the pelvis is closed. He's still facing back here with his belt buckle. And he gets this very late unloading of the pelvis. But what I want to talk about is the direction that he's able to maintain during this position. So a lot of coaches, athletes, they think that this hinge is just coiling over the back hip spinning and firing, like kind of like a shot putter, or it's just coil and fire. But really how you're able to do this and still throw strikes and still maintain direction is that as he has this coil, right, the pelvis is coiled back this way, he's maintaining direction with the back hip and with the direction of the stride and with where his weight is and his center of mass is over that back foot. So he's still maintaining this direction towards the target even while the pelvis is in this coiled closed position. So watch him move forward. He's holding that closed pelvic position, and this linear move gives his throw direction. It gives the pelvis this linear position as he's moving towards the target, but it still gives him something as he gets to the end of that move to unload. So it's not just loading and firing like a shot putter or a discus or any of those things. There's a direction to the throw. We can see this from the front. He rotationally loads, but there's a very linear and direct path that he's taking. That's a bad line. There's a very linear movement that he's taking from this closed off position. So as you learn to get into the glutes, as you learn to close off your pelvis, just remember to maintain direction. This is one of the reasons that I'll kind of harp on guys throwing with a partner or throwing, if you're going to go outside and long toss, throw on the line, give your throws some direction. As far as repeatability, as far as arm slot, as far as the ability to throw strikes, a big piece of that, a big piece of combining this rotational load and this rotational unload is adding this direction to the linear component. Again, just what I'm talking about, if you're my target and I load into the back hip, it's not just pushing off and coming out of that load. It's maintaining that load and having this linear direction towards the target. It's night and day in terms of the ability to actually repeat that arm slot and unload everything in the same plane. So let's just look at that unload. Right, another thing I want to highlight, as he unloads, it might look like he's just spinning the pelvis open, but we like to think of it, we like to coach guys to think about unloading the pelvis down into landing or rotating down into landing, right? So he's fully closed off just a few frames before landing, right? His belt buckle is still facing back here, just a hair before landing. Now he corkscrews into landing at the last second, but it's this action of, can I get from this closed off position a hair before landing right here and somehow get my hips open into landing? How do I get from this position to this position? And it's not by spinning the hips open this way, spinning them in the transverse plane like a merry-go-round. When we tell guys to think of it much more like a Ferris wheel, much more like a north to south, rotating down into landing, landing from above, any of these cues, they start to be able to get from this closed position, this loaded hinge, and it becomes a rotation down into landing, and that fires and syncs up the planes of rotation, and ultimately that gets into better direction, better ball velocity, and better repeatability. So rotating the pelvis down into landing is the cue. I can't tell you that's what he's thinking, but this is the cue of how to get from here and have that energy actually unwind its way from this closed position up the chain and out into the ball. And so that the angle of the pelvic rotation should match the angle of the arm slot and the angle of the torso rotation. So hopefully that makes sense. We've made other videos on this. I'll make sure to link some of those in the description if you guys want more information about that. All right, so let's take a closer look at his arm action. Now he has a pretty simple arm action. There's not a ton of moving parts, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And so what we see is a very simple arm path where he's capturing energy. There isn't there aren't any lags or any hitches. And so from handbrake, his arm just takes a simple path that extends down and it winds up this spiral staircase. Free of tension, he gets into this position that we like to talk about, where we call it an arm flip up, but it's basically this scapuloided position where the arm is up at landing, but it's behind the head. And so you create this space, this daylight behind the head where the arm is flipped up. It's gone through this spiral staircase pattern. It's flipped up, and at landing, you're in this scap retracted position, this horizontal abduction, and you can see daylight behind the head from where the arm is flipped up. So that's the arm flip up that we like to talk about. It's really difficult for pitchers to get into this position if they have any sort of mobility restriction or a major timing issue. So a lot of times you'll see lower level throwers, slower throwers. Guys a lot of times have arm issues when they have major timing issues. But you'll see these guys where they land and the arm is just down and they never get into that flip up position where that arm gets up and back behind their head. So that can be a limit from pec major, pec minor, lat, subclavius, anything on the anterior side of the shoulder. It can be a protective mechanism. A lot of times you'll see guys that are just late and they have bad timing as a protective mechanism against a shoulder issue they've been having, an elbow issue. So there are a lot of reasons that can happen in lower level throwers if you don't see this in your own mechanics. But again, he gets into a good position. He is free of tension in his arm until landing. So he's in a good, relaxed position at landing. Now he gets that impulse from the front leg. Now the arm turns on. Now there's this reflexive firing of the pec. And now he's just pulling down with absolute electricity in the ball release. And this is the active component of his arm action. So again, not a ton to break down with his arm path. Very, very simple. It does what it's supposed to do. You can see there's a mirroring. The glove arm and the throwing arm work in unison, right? With this type of extended arm at this point, you typically wouldn't want to see a bent glove arm, and vice versa. If you had a very, very short, compact arm action back here, you wouldn't want to see an extended glove arm. So the glove arm and the throwing arm are working in unison. Very, very simple, free of tension, gets into the right positions, pulls down with electricity late. So overall, clean arm action, pretty good example of elite patterns from that standpoint. Now, there's a lot more things that we could talk about in his mechanics, but the last one that I think we have time to talk about that I want to focus on is looking at what his back foot does as he begins to rotate and as he works his way down the mound. So during leg lift, right, he's stable on the back foot. There's not much movement. He's on the inside of his back heel, right? This is typically what we want to see in throwers. During that leg lift, you want to see, if you have to think about where on the foot that weight is, you don't want it on the ball of the foot leaning forward. You don't want it on the outside of the foot staying too stuck back. You want it on the inside of the heel, and so that's what he's doing. He's got the weight on the inside of that back heel, stable foot position, and because it's stable, he's in a position to really drop his weight into that back glute and project himself forward. But take a look at what happens as he actually unloads the pelvis. Right, there's no triple extending, there's no pushing off the back leg and trying to show the laces to the ground. What actually happens is he's trying to stay in contact with this back foot anchor. He's trying to grab the ground and ride his center of mass as long as he possibly can. And at the last second, he unloads. And what happens as he's trying to stay back, he's trying to stay in that back foot, and the pelvis goes and the shoulders stay back, is that you get this eversion. You get this turning over of the back foot. And so that's what you see right here. This back foot begins to tilt and turn over. And that's a sign that he's really trying to stay into his backside as long as he can, as he moves down the mound, as his pelvis goes, and that's the start of this chain reaction. The pelvis goes, and it cues this back foot to evert, turnover, and then once it reaches the end of its available range, the knee turns over, everything begins to go. But this is something that's very, very commonly missed. When athletes they have a history of ankle problems, they're missing that eversion, they're missing the ability to move through that back ankle, they have ankle mobility issues. A lot of times what you'll see is instead of this back foot rolling over into eversion like this, it basically will just pop up and over. So just to zoom out for a second, just so you guys can identify what normally happens when an athlete's missing ankle mobility. What happens is basically that back foot just pops up and off. The heel just rolls up and off versus staying in the backside, eversion, tibial internal rotation, and then it begins to come up and off the ground, the heel does. So again, just something subtle that a lot of people probably aren't talking about, but the role of the back foot, the role of ankle mobility really can't be overstated in terms of staying into your backside, maintaining direction, holding the pelvis closed, and getting as much as you possibly can out of your lower half. So really prioritizing foot stability, really prioritizing ankle mobility, dorsiflexion, and eversion, inversion, specifically eversion. And I would really be aware of high top cleats, ankle braces, anything that's kind of going to act as a crutch and limit that motion at the back ankle. That can really be an issue and lead to a lot of these other issues up the chain, arm injuries that we'll see from guys popping out of their lower half early, flying open with their front side, then their arms start to take on more stress. So some of these arm issues that guys have can be linked down the kinetic chain. Some of them really can start with the foot. They can start with a lack of foot stability, or they can start with a lack of foot mobility to be able to stay into the backside and grab the ground as long as possible. So hopefully that was interesting. That was just something unique that we haven't touched on as much. Overall, Sixto Sanchez, super talented guy. I'm very excited for his career. He's a high effort guy, but again, I find that exciting to watch guys like him, Max Scherzer, Jacob deGrom. I find it super exciting to watch these guys just go out there and chuck flames and have really, really plus stuff. So definite ace potential. Really excited to see him in the future. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. We're trying to get to 20,000 subscribers by the end of this year on YouTube. So definitely help us out there. Until then, I will see you guys in the next video.